Hello and welcome to Text Readings with Greg Stafford, where we work our way progressively through the ancient biblical books and related texts and histories according to the translations that I've done to date of both the Hebrew and the Greek texts that represent the Bible best. We study the Bible because we've come to believe it represents reliable, accurate history, describing not only the events since the creation of humankind, but even before that time. Not everyone accepts that, but what the Bible describes can be checked. It can be looked at and then tested scientifically to determine, as well as historically, if what it says is correct. If it's correct in terms of how it describes the creation process and the time in which it takes place. And I've talked about both of those things in prior videos concerning the Genesis 1 through 3 texts. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those if you haven't already. But we reviewed them thoroughly and we evaluated whether or not what is described is consistent with what we are told today is scientific, is accurate. And it was shown, I believe clearly, that in all respects, the Bible, in terms of what it describes as the creation process, is accurate. And so both before the time of humankind and since, there are reasons to accept the Bible as reliable. Whether you accept it as inspired or from God, that's something for you to decide next, right? First, you have to resolve the question of whether or not you're actually going to give the Bible an opportunity to be tested and determine whether or not it is accurate, scientifically or historically. And if it is, then from there you can measure it against other texts or other reasons to believe and determine whether or not it is enough. Right? For us, it is. It represents sufficient history and description of events that tell us about the God Jah and the different things he did, the different peoples he used, and ultimately, in our view, the sending of one of his sons, others of whom he had used in the past, such as angels who are described in the biblical text, and other sons who rebelled against him, like the devil and the angels who followed him. But there was one son, the firstborn in our view, and what the Bible describes as the firstborn of God, became a man and was ultimately killed according to the biblical texts that were written before he even lived. I've done a whole series about texts that foretell events in connection with Jesus, the one whom we believe God sent to the earth to redeem us from the fall of Adam and Eve. This is all tied into the teaching of the biblical text, specifically Genesis, and everything else. Like I said, it ultimately leads, in our belief, to the coming of Jesus and his giving his life as the last Adam. He's called that specifically in 1 Corinthians 15:45, because the only other Adam was Adam, and that Adam died. He died because he chose wrongly, whereas Jesus died because someone wrongly killed him. And therefore, it was a legal means by which God could give him, in our view, authority over the earth, which in our view has been happening since his death and will continue to happen until ultimately God's kingdom comes. And so that's what we pray for to happen. But until that time, we try to live according to the life that Jesus lived, right? Treating others the way we want to be treated, giving the God Jah glory and honor, and trying to become as good a people as we can in spite of the sin that we've inherited from our first human parents and from everyone else since then. And so to that end, we look to the biblical text to try to keep us on the right path, right? The way, the truth, and the life through Jesus Christ in our view, that brings us to God, Jaho. But there are others, such as the Jews, some today who still believe in the biblical text and who believe in the God of the biblical text, but who don't accept Jesus as the Messiah. So everyone in our view, I believe, can benefit from our reading of these biblical texts, but not everyone is going to have the same beliefs. And that's fine. So we'll discuss them to the extent that we can. Today's text is going to involve an account in Genesis that is the last text I've translated outside of the first 11 chapters that we've already reviewed. And I did this part of Genesis because I wanted to see a little bit more about what was involved with Jacob's ladder. I was doing a lot of Ancient Aliens and Christian comparison stuff, and some videos that the Ancient Alien advocates produce involving Jacob's ladder see it as a sort of an encounter with aliens, a spaceship, with a ladder coming down where you can ascend and descend into the ship if you have that view. So I wanted to look at the biblical account a bit more because it doesn't really describe a ship, does it? I mean, it does have descriptions that I guess you could look at in certain ways, and we'll get to them in a moment, but it doesn't specifically describe a metallic ship in this account, like the Ancient Alien theorists often believe. So, but what is this ladder, right? What is this ladder going up and down? Well, let's take a look at it. So up until this point, at least from our last reading in Genesis 11, where we talked about the Tower of Babel and how Jaho separated all of the peoples that had migrated into Sumer after the flood. And then from there, he spread them out into all the areas of the earth as we see them now and had seen them since then. And that's why we see language is really only datable back to the same time when all of these events are said to have happened, with possibly some pre-flood glyphs or cuneiform writing samples, but they would be right, before the time after the flood, when after they migrated south, the Tower of Babel events happened. So probably within several hundred years, for sure, after the flood, you had the whole Tower of Babel account. And so after that, we only did part of chapter 11 up until the end of that account, and then I hadn't translated the Genesis texts from 11 to this point of Genesis 28 that we're going to read today. But just to give us a brief summary of key points that lead to this reading today from Genesis 11, where we last left off. So we know after the Tower of Babel and the confusion of languages that happened in Sumer, Babylon, essentially, Mesopotamia. We know that Jaho chose Abram, who eventually was renamed as Abraham, or Abraham. But he chose Abraham from Ur, right, a city in Mesopotamia that we can show existed today. And he made a promise to Abraham that he would multiply his seed as the sand of the sea and the stars of the heaven. So then he brings Abraham to Sarah, and Abraham has a child first by Sarah's maidservant, Hagar. He has Ishmael, and then he has a child by Sarah, Isaac. And so eventually Isaac meets Rebekah, and they have a son, Jacob. But the first son they have is Esau, the firstborn. Eventually, Jacob gets the rights from Esau as firstborn, and therefore also the blessing from Isaac, and becomes the one through whom Jaho is going to fulfill the promise. And that's not an example that can assist Trinitarians in any way, or people who don't believe that Jesus is actually Jah's real firstborn, like he's presented in the biblical text several times. Because in this account, it describes the literal firstborn, or in the account preceding the reading we're going to do today involving Esau and Jacob, the literal firstborn gives away his right as firstborn. He's still the firstborn, though, right? And nothing like that is said to have happened in connection with Jesus, right? That's not how he got to be firstborn. We know that's how Jacob got the blessing of the firstborn, but none of that is described in relation to Jesus. He's described as the actual firstborn, just as the firstborn. No qualification, no account involving someone else giving him something or him obtaining the rights as something or being just called something, right? Like Israel was, in some sense, God's firstborn, right? But that's not the context, nor is it the same in terms of the example that would be parallel to the text involving Jesus as a real person, simply described as God's firstborn. No one else is given that term or description. There's no one else we could even name as God's firstborn, right? Whereas in the Esau-Jacob account, we know them both, right? We know what happened. We know which one is which one. So there's nothing like that involving Jesus. But Trinitarians will run to this account and say, see, Firstborn doesn't always mean firstborn. Well, actually it does, even here. It's just the rights of what the real firstborn are given away by that one. So nothing like that, as I said, is involved with Jesus Christ and his being described as the firstborn. So it's a false parallel and in fact doesn't fit, as I said, the text describing Jesus Christ. So with that in mind, Jacob receives the right as firstborn and the blessing. And then we get, essentially, soon thereafter, we get to the account involving Jacob's dream and this ladder. So let's take a look. Genesis 28. We're going to read Genesis 28, verses 11 through 13, and then 16 through 17, because that's all I've translated to this point. It's not a long account, although we're going to read the Greek and the Hebrew, so it's twice the number of verses. And then once we finish today's text, we'll go back through, highlight a few key points. This will be our last Genesis day text or text reading for now, at least until we come back around. We're going to go into Exodus next. But eventually we'll get back to Genesis. I'll translate more texts. And who knows, maybe we'll do a Series A, Series B, if we can complement the existing Genesis shows, or we'll just do the missing text. We'll see. Let's do today's reading. Starting in verse 11, Genesis 28. The Hebrew translation is marked by H, and the Greek translation marked by G. You're welcome to follow along in your own text, of course. Verse 11, Hebrew translation. Now as he, that is Jacob, arrived at a certain location, then he prepared to stay the night, because the sun had set. So he began to take from among the stones in that place, and he began to make a place for his head. Then he, that is Jacob, began to lie down in that very place. Verse 11, Greek translation. Then he moved to a location, and there he fell asleep, for the sun had gone down. So he collected from among the stones of this place, and he set them up for his head, and then he fell asleep in that place. Verse 12, Hebrew translation. Then he, that is Jacob, began to dream, and behold, an elevation fixed in place on the ground, and its head reaching into the heavens. And behold, messengers or angels of God were going up and coming down by means of it. So this is the dream that Jacob is having in this place. Try to take a moment and just sort of visualize what it might be like based on what you know in terms of the descriptions given, right? An elevation from the ground, height into the heavens. You know, how high is hard to determine, right? We weren't in the, having the dream, but certainly from the ground up high with angels of Jaho going up and coming down by means of it, using effectively this elevation in some way, right? We might think of an escalator, a stair, a ladder. Any of those are devices that are used to go up and down. We'll talk about it more in a moment in terms of what it likely means. Verse 12, Greek translation, while sleeping, he, that is Jacob, had a dream, and behold, a stairway had been fixed in the earth, which the top was reaching into the heavens, and the angels, or messengers of God, were going up and coming down on it. Verse 13, Hebrew translation, and behold, Jaho stood over it, and he began to say, I am Jaho, God of Abraham your father, and God of Isaac. The land on which you lie down, I will give it to you and to your offspring, or seed. Verse 13, Greek translation, but the Lord Jaho had been set over it, or had been made strong upon it. And he said, I am Jaho, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. He's talking to Jacob. You must not be afraid. The land upon which you are resting, I will give it to you and to your offspring. Verse 16, Hebrew translation. Then Jacob began to wake up from his sleep, and he said, truly, Jaho is here in this very place, and I did not know it. So obviously, the realization that you were just in the presence of Jaho, whether a dream or not, especially while sleeping on this rock, that would be a lot to take in upon waking. Verse 16, then Jacob rose up from his sleep and he said, Lord Jaho is in this place, but I had not been aware of it. Verse 17, then he began to fear and to say, how deserving of fear is this place? Not just this place, but if it is a house of God, and if this is a gate of the heavens. Verse 17, Greek translation, then he felt fear and he said, how terrifying is this place? This is nothing other than a house of God. And this, like referring to the elevation from earth into the heavens, is the gate or the door of heaven. So, now this last reference, or close to the last reference in verse 17, the house of God, if it is a house of God, the place that he's in, right? Not the elevation, which he refers to as a gate or a door of the heavens or of heaven, but the place he's in, he refers to it upon waking as a house of God, or Bet-El, which is the Bethel that you often hear. You're involved with the Watchtower Society, is the name of the headquarters in New York. I believe it's still the headquarters either way. But that's essentially what that's based on, is this text. And so also the Jacob's ladder, right? Jacob's dream, Jacob's ladder, stairway to heaven. Those are all references ultimately back to this account. So let's take a look at it. We can actually we're pretty sure, see this location today. Although before we do, let me actually point out a couple things. So we're going to read this article too, because before we look at the place, let me give some information on this term. So in the Hebrew text of Genesis, I believe it was verse 12. Let's just bring that up. Yes, a stairway or an elevation in the Hebrew text. The Hebrew word is sulam. It's the only time the word appears in the Hebrew text is right here, an elevation. And then in the Greek text, a stairway, these are my translations, but I'm explaining about the words involved, is klimax, which is used 4 other times other than this text, 2 in Nehemiah, and both of the texts in Nehemiah involve a stairway, not a ladder. Clearly, like the stairway in the city of David. So they clearly both in the 2 Nehemiah texts involve a stairway, not a ladder. And then there are two instances in Maccabees, one in 1 Maccabees, where it actually does mean a ladder, like a part of an engine of war, a siege ladder. And then it refers to the ladder of Tyre. And that's what we're going to read about right here. This reference here kind of summarizes the different senses which can be given to klimax and I guess sulam, although actually even another sense, as you'll see. So what's the ladder of Tyre? We'll take a look at it image-wise in a moment, real briefly, but you can look it up at yours as well. But this article from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia on the ladder of Tyre, again, this is the references, so let me just verify that. Read this real briefly. Antiochus VI, after having confirmed Jonathan in the high priesthood, let's talk about during the Maccabean period, appointed his brother Simon captain over the territory included between the ladder of Tyre, because we're looking at the word used in Genesis 28:12, where it refers to a fixed elevation or a stairway into heaven from the earth, whether that means ladder, stairway, or something else. And in one of the other references, then stairway or ladder is to the ladder of Tyre, the city of Tyre. So what is the ladder of Tyre? After Antiochus VI, after confirming Jonathan, he appointed his brother Simon captain over the territory included between the ladder of Tyre and the borders of Egypt. The ladder has been located at different points off the coast between Tyre and Acre, such as the Rosh El Abiyad Promontorium album of the ancient geographers, about 7 miles south of Tyre, and Rosh En Nakura, about 6 miles farther south, and Rosh El Musharifeh, a little farther on. These are capes, rock formations, jutting westward into the sea from the ridge, which runs parallel to the general line of the coast. These capes project more than a mile into the sea and present a very bold and precipitous front from 200 to 300 feet. Look them up. We might check them in a moment, but they're not directly related to our text and account in Genesis. So I might just go right to the archaeology involving where Jacob's dream occurred. But nonetheless, they're easy to find. So it's a location we can see today. It's just a question of whether or not it's the rock formation itself or the stairs cut on the rocks. I'll read the rest of this article here. The ascent on either side of the promontory is very steep, and at Rash el Abiyad, steps were cut in the white rock, which led to the identification of this point with the ladder, but also a reference to Josephus leads to a different conclusion. But a reference to Josephus leads to a different conclusion. Josephus locates it 100 stadia north of Acre, which corresponds fairly well with the southern limit of the whole promontory, which is about 12 miles north of Acre, but not at all with Rash el Abiyad. The altitude of El Musharifeh is greater than that of El Abiyad and may have had steps cut in it similar to the latter. It is more probable that the ladder of Tyre was here or at En Nakura, but the term applied to the whole promontory, which offered a serious obstacle to the passage of armies or even caravans, since the approach is precipitous on either side, and at Rash el Abiyad, the road skirts the edge of a sheer precipice. We'll look at it in just a second, where a misstep would hurl one into the sea some 200 feet below. The application of the term to the whole promontory seems to be indicated by Josephus, since he speaks of it as one of the mountains which encompass the plains of Ptolemy, Acre, and the highest of all. This would not be true of any one of the three capes mentioned, but would be if the hills behind, which form their base, were included. That it was designated as the ladder of Tyre rather than of Acre was probably due to the fact that the promontory is near the former city. Okay, and I'll put a link to this article in the description below, but we're looking at this to show that in addition to an actual ladder, which I only found in terms of the Greek word klimaks, used in 1 Maccabees, whereas the two other references other than Genesis 28:12 in Nehemiah use it clearly for actual steps, not a ladder. So let's see what we have here. Okay, that's the one we're going to go to in a moment. Here are images. I'm not going to get too much into it because, again, this isn't directly related to Jacob's ladder. It's just another term used, another example of the term used in Genesis 28:12 for what is often called Jacob's ladder in reference to another location, this rock formation right here. And so it's not just, you have these rocks here, these capes, kind of looks like a ladder or of sorts, although it wouldn't be necessarily, I guess if you were going along the coast, right? But also there are stairs cut in from the capes. So it's hard to say exactly what the reference is here to the ladder of Tyre. But either way, it's an example of how the term can be used for something other than a literal ladder or probably a literal stairway as well. Unless, again, that's what the reference is in terms of what was cut into the hillside here and from the capes below. So, in any way, this gives you sort of a general idea of the term used in Genesis 28:12. And now let's take a look at the location that many believe Genesis 12 occurred in, or in which the events described in Genesis 28 that we read just a moment ago, including verse 12, occurred. So here you have sort of an overview, and I'll put a link in the description below. This is from BibleWalks.com, Bet El, Jacob's Dream. Here's sort of a small picture of a Crusader cathedral that was built later. We'll look at that in a moment. And an Islamic shrine as well. But before those were built at this site, there is clearly evidence that this place was older and used by others. So let's just take a look. The site was holy to three regions: a Muslim prayer house, a Crusader period chapel, and ancient Jewish tombs, and a fortified compound that may have been Jeroboam's altar. We'll get to that archaeological evidence in more detail when we get to that account, although it might come up again here because it's located right next to this site. Some scholars suggest that this was the place of Jacob's dream based on its location and the elements that exist on the hill. Its tradition may have been preserved here and reflected in the holiness of the site to the three religions, which are based on ancient Jewish traditions. And then it cites Genesis 28:12. The site is located on a high mountain north of the modern community of Beit El, House of God, about 20 kilometers north of Jerusalem. I'll put this in the description below so you can take a look at it and enlarge it for yourself. But to keep it on the split screen here and the way that it is, it has a little key, so it marks the Bet El settlement right here. Here's an access road that will take you to the area of Jacob's dream, marked right here next to the tower walls. And so it gives a little more historical information that you can take a look at on your own. It gives different illustrations of the events. But then we get to the actual excavations and real evidence. So here's an overview. The southern view of the site shows the center of the complex. On the left is the Sheikh's tomb. So this is the shrine right here, dedicated to Sheikh Abdallah. In the center is a large rock platform, where according to some scholars, this is the rock of Jacob's dream. On the right is an ancient 1,000-year-old oak tree right here. And I know there's some Crusader elements, I believe, in the vicinity of this Muslim shrine or Sheikh shrine right here. An aerial view of the site shows the larger area of the complex with a view towards the northeast. As seen in this view, a great view of the land of Israel opens up from all sides. So he's referring to this right here. This high place may indeed fit a probable site where Jacob views his promised land. So here again you see the Sheikh shrine, the 1,000-year-old oak. And here's the large rock right here, this big flat rock area that they believe is where Jacob had his dream. But it doesn't describe a giant flat rock on which he had the dream, right? It does describe an area which could be this spot on which he set several stones to rest his head. And then it gives another view with a further legend below. So here again, it marks it as the Jacob Dream Rock. Here's ancient walls, tower, tomb, the old oak tree. So you have the Muslim shrine right here it's on the left of Jacob's Dream Rock, but it's on the far right of this entire structure because it looks like the left part of this structure is the Crusader chapel, which is why this sort of looked, they were as if they were in the same location from the view we had earlier. And then up here on the top, you have Jeroboam's temple, another biblical place that we'll get to in further detail another time. So here's sort of a close to ground level view of that flat rock area that is believed traditionally to be where Jacob set the stones and rested and had his dream. Here's the 1,000-year-old oak. You can take a look at that further on your own. And then it gives us a better view of the Muslim prayer house. It says the structure has two sections. On the left is a closed room used as a Muslim prayer place. On the right is an open arched building, which is a Crusader period chapel. So it's like you had both religions, at least in terms of the Crusaders and the Muslims, with prayer places side by side. And then you have a view of the entrance to the prayer room on the southern wall of the chapel. And then this is like a prayer niche that I guess points to Mecca, or what is believed to be Mecca. That's a whole nother question. We'll get to another time, perhaps. And some decorations on the wall. It says the Mihrab's wall is decorated with paintings of red trees. The branches of palm trees are often used as decorations in Muslim holy sites, as the palm tree symbolizes life. There are views of the prayer house and Crusader Chapel right here. So you can see a lot has been made of this place over time by Muslims, Christian crusaders, quote unquote, on the Christian part. And then, of course, Jews who traditionally regard this site as where Jacob had his dream, which is right next to the Temple of Jeroboam. And there are other ancient aspects to the location, including walls that could very well fit the location of Jacob's dream. So this is what is historically believed to be what we just read about, the location that is, the Bet El, the house of God, the location where when Jacob was dreaming, he saw an elevation fixed from the ground into the heavens, where angels of God were descending by means of it. And we talked about the different uses of the Greek term used in that account, klimox, since it's only used once in the Hebrew text, sulam, of Genesis 28:12. And from the analysis of the Greek usage in the biblical instances, the two other instances in Nehemiah, other than Genesis 28:12, and then in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, we can't really say for sure, but it could be a stairway, it could be a ladder, or it could be something totally different, right? Like the ladder of Tyre, which may be in some sense like a ladder or like a stairway, but really, it's just massive, impressive rocks. So whether or not that's the case, or the stairs cut into those areas, the fact is that Jacob saw something that he could describe according to something he knew, which could either be stairs or a ladder, and angels of God using it. Probably they were using more like a stairway, wouldn't you say? I mean, I'm not going to make it an issue, but just when I think about it, remember I asked you to earlier visualize what Jacob was dreaming about? When I do that, I don't really see angels climbing up a ladder or even something like it, right? It seems to me more believable in terms of the way angels are otherwise described as holy servants of God. They wouldn't necessarily be depicted even in a dream as sort of like having to laboriously go through this process of going up and down, even with some uncertainty, right? When you're going down a ladder or up, it's not so easy. Whereas when you're stepping up and down, you're seeing what's going on right in front of you completely. Or maybe even like we use today, an escalator, right? We're more advanced, right? Obviously they're more advanced. So Jacob may have seen something like a ladder, like a stairway, but really more like, it may have been really more of an escalator, at least in terms of our progression from that time, if what we're doing is more like them, right? Or becomes more like it over time. Either way, we get the idea. But I wanted to go over it and get a good understanding of it and visualize it with you. Since I had translated this part of the account in relation to my Christians and Ancient Alien studies, so it's good for us to visualize some of these things to the extent that we credibly can, in light of the usage of the word, in light of the archaeology, so that we can then better discuss these texts, right? So when someone brings up this account involving the stairway to heaven or Jacob's ladder in this dream, right, we can say, there's the place where that happened is pretty well established. And the account and what it describes is something that we're becoming more and more like and believing more and more in terms of visitation. Even people who believe in aliens, right? They see this kind of interaction with non-human beings and human beings. So it's not like what's talked about or described here is inconsistent with what people have been describing happening to them for thousands of years. And of course, this is in the context of a number of other events and peoples that we can establish actually lived, or the places that they are said to have been from, like Ur and Abraham. All of them, in terms of the totality of peoples described in the Bibles and the ones with whom they are related and from whom they descended, as in the case of Isaac from Abraham and Jacob from Isaac, all worshiping the same God, right? Jaho telling Jacob in this dream, I am Jaho. So when we talk about Jaho, we're talking about the God of Abraham. We're talking about the God of Isaac, Abraham's son. We're talking about the God of Jacob, the chosen one who, even though he wasn't firstborn, was given the rights as firstborn because Jaho was preparing a people. And through that people, he was preparing a body, just like he prepares everyone else's body. But this body was being prepared since the time that humankind was spared after our first parents failed to be faithful to Jaho. He foretold a seed that would come through them eventually. It would bring about the end of the wicked one. And we believe that all of these events that are described, including the events involving Jacob and the dream he was given and everything that happened to him, all ties into and points directly at the body that was made for Jesus. The body that the Bible elsewhere describes was prepared by Jaho. And if that involved choosing certain peoples like the Hebrews, choosing a certain person like Abraham, and further choosing between the offspring of those chosen peoples, in the case of Abraham, the choosing of Jacob over Esau, even though, according to the arrangement at that time, Esau would have been the one given that blessing. Jaho did everything necessary to bring about his will, which was that the right body would be ready for his son, in our view, Jesus from heaven, the Son of God, the firstborn. When that one's time came to take on flesh, to live among us, and to teach us the will of Jah, we believe he did all those things and that he will do what the texts say is next. And that is bring about a world that is free of all wickedness. All the things that have come about since people rebelled against Jah, and establish a place, the whole earth, everything, as where you can go and find someone who knows about Jah, about what he does, about what the earth is for, about why we're here, what we're supposed to do, no confusion, no more. And that's the goal of these text readings, right? To prepare us to enter that place so that until we get to the time where everybody knows their place, we can do what we have to do. We can rely on the information that's been prepared and preserved for us, gain strength from these texts, continue to use them as a guide. First and foremost, in our view, Jesus Christ. So he's the model for Christians anyway. But these texts are also important, and they help guide the way because, as I said, they're all written and describing, ultimately, what Jah said would happen to free humanity from what happened.